This series of videos reflects the contribution of Professor Paul Lysaker to our understanding of people who present with symptoms of severe mental disorders. Paul termed his work metacognitive reflection and insight therapy, or MERIT for short. The informal conversations in this series were drawn from online case consultations and reflects Paul's thinking around the key components of this approach.
This is an idea that enables me to have some understanding of him and to relate to him. So how do you measure that? The biggest turn in the road for this research program happens in 2003 when we get a hold of the Metacognition assessment scale. It's a scale originally published by Semerari et al., meant to code frequencies of metacognitive activities in a psychotherapy session. And we altered it significantly. And we created in its place the Metacognition assessment scale, abbreviated, or MASS-A. And in this method, we get a narrative interview. We ask someone to talk about their life and their sense of it. And then with the MASS-A scores, we get 4 measurements. And those measurements are the degree of integration of the self, or self-reflectivity, the degree of integration of others, or awareness of other people, the degree of integration about how human beings fit into the larger community, or decentration versus centrality, and the use of that knowledge within the flow of life to respond to what's happening. And that's is referred to as mastery. So I'll mention that. So mastery is not about having a particular coping strategy. It could be, but it's much more than that. It's really, how do I decide to live with the challenges and things that are possible? How do I maintain some equilibrium? How do I manage these things which frustrate me, which emerge and offer me opportunities, etc.? How do I deal with change? How do I have an evolving sense? All right, so this is the scale of the MASS-A. And I'm going to just say a few words about how the scale is organized. If you're interested, we share it for free and we offer free training exercises for it. But each of the items of the MASS-A, the Metacognition Assessment Scale abbreviated, are metacognitive acts. Each specific item is an act. Those items, as you know, are arranged in different subscales. But within each subscale, items are in order of increasing complexity, such that item 4 of the self-reflectivity scale is more complex than item 3 and not as complex as item 5. And to be able to perform an item, you need to be able to successfully perform the level below it, or the item below it. So if I can't perform item 4, I can't perform item 5. And therefore, the final score ends up being the string of items that I can perform successfully as rated within the narrative. And therefore, higher scores reflect more lower scores reflect more fragmented experience, and higher scores reflect more integrated experience. I'll just flash this on the screen. Here are the items. We don't really have time to go into them, and it would seem like a possible distraction. But this is an example of the self-reflectivity scale and the items that are here. And again, I'm happy to share it freely. And we can get back and talk more about it if you want. So back to the original slide, we have fragmentation of experience, or metacognitive impairments in self-reflectivity, awareness of others, centrality, and mastery. This, in sense of disability, is lived as a lack of agency, possibility, challenges, and ultimately isolation and disconnection. In metacognition, it's much more about how I integrate information into a complex, responsive idea of the person, which isn't going to necessarily be right or wrong. So if we take Robert again as an example, I've known Robert for several years and have a particular idea about him. Those of you who have been his students though for several years likely have a different idea. And it isn't that my idea is right or wrong, or yours is right or wrong, but our ideas are affected to the extent that we have an evolving idea of who Robert is. So, if you were, to encounter him in another setting, and you'd have to integrate that information into your idea of him. So if I pretend that you go to, just do a thought experiment, pretend you go to a grocery store, You encounter Robert, and he has a gigantic American cowboy hat on, and he has a shopping cart full of really bad tasting American light beer, and he's driving around in the grocery store. That's going to be something to think about. How are you going to fit that with your other images of Robert? But that's what's happening in metacognition. We're constantly evolving and creating different ideas. That was a completely theoretical and not an actual experience of Robert in the grocery store. So back to the big clinical implication, promoting metacognitive capacity could facilitate recovery, could help people figure out what's happening in their lives and how to live their life. And I think this is theoretically, I think, what's happening in these cases that I was involved in working with in Ohio in the 1980s when I was a graduate student. I think that's the process that was happening. Somehow, people were getting better at doing this. Their metacognitive capacity was increasing, and there was a more coherent, integrated sense of who they were. Maybe a small important point is that with metacognitive deficits, it isn't that you don't have a self, but it's that the self exists in pieces. It doesn't seem to fit together. There's no larger coherent whole. And then some people describe that as a loss of a sense of self, but it's really an integrated sense of self. One of the first really powerful cases I was ever involved with, I was in a community center in the American state of Connecticut. And I worked with a really sort of neurotic young man. And his dad was a bastard and his mom was a saint. And his girlfriend had broke up with him and his best friend had died. And he just wanted to play the blues and not have to deal with anything else. He was a guitarist. And anyway, as therapy goes on, he ends up having a terrible psychotic break, triggered in part by cannabis, but it becomes a horrible psychosis. And all he can do is think about people persecuting him and wanting to kill him. And he ends up angry at me one day because I won't support him in his efforts to protect himself from the people persecuting him. And more or less, I share with him my frustration with him, which is that he and I used to have very rich conversations, and now we can only talk about one thing. And he says, you're right, we can only talk about that one thing. Because if I don't look at that one thing, I can't find anything in me. And his metaphor was that there was like exploded pieces of a planet were left in him. There were fragments and shards of what he used to be. And in fact, his odd beliefs was sort of a gravity that kept those somewhere nearby, but they could never fit together again. First question you can ask is, are metacognitive deficits commonly found in serious mental illness? And so what we do is we gather a group of patients with schizophrenia or psychotic disorders, compare them to others, and ask the question, are the MAS-A scores indicative of more fragmentation in people diagnosed with psychosis? And here's a paper where Ilani compared people with schizophrenia to healthy controls, finding far more fragmentation in people with schizophrenia. Now we have bipolar disorder and healthy controls. This is a study done in Italy. Again, people with schizophrenia have poor metacognition than the other two groups, and the bipolar group has poor metacognition than the healthy controls. Here, schizophrenia was compared to people with PTSD and substance misuse. We again find that people with psychosis have significant metacognitive problems. And we get a hint of a different set of metacognitive problems for people with PTSD, more to do with mastery. Here we compare people with borderline personality, schizophrenia, and substance misuse. We also get a really interesting picture where the borderline patients, people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, have a unique metacognitive profile in which they have very poor mastery, just like the schizophrenia patients, but they have a decent amount of self-reflectivity and awareness of others. So it isn't that they can't think about themselves and others, but there is no responsive sense of how to manage challenges and possibilities. We looked at people with early onset psychosis, first episode, and found that really profound levels of fragmentation in people with first episode psychosis. So I apologize for the whirlwind presentation, but across a number of studies, we see that in fact, this scale suggests greater fragmentation in the experience of self, others, in the world. Next question is this related to anything? So does it matter if you have a fragmented sense of self or others? Because if not, who cares? So here we looked at people who had diagnosed with schizophrenia, and we find that people who are rated as having poor metacognition report that they're more dominated by symptoms, irregardless of ratings of symptom severity, and they have less of a sense of reaching out to others for connection. Here we find that poor metacognition predicts higher levels of negative symptoms at a follow-up point in first episode patients, and that's irregardless of initial levels of negative symptoms. We find the same thing here from an Indiana study. Poor metacognition predicts more negative symptoms in the future. Same thing found again in a Danish study over 3 years with first episode patients. And in particular, striking here is that lower levels of metacognition predict future difficulties expressing emotion and being able to express oneself in a way that makes sense to others. It would make complete sense intuitively. I mean, if I can't form a rich and coherent picture of myself and others, it would be desperately difficult to understand how I might express that to you or let you know what's happening. It's a recent replication in a Russian sample. And I'm going to just show you a picture of maybe how metacognition operates at an empirical level in terms of how metacognitive deficits. This is a sample of I want to say 154 people. That number may be off a little bit. It was published in the British Journal of Clinical Psychology. Lauren Luther is the first author. And what she did was to predict functional status using a structural equation model where everything begins with metacognition. And we found a path through intrinsic motivation. And what that is to say is that lower levels of metacognition may lead directly to poor levels of function, but they may also lead to lesser levels of intrinsic motivation, which then enhances the functional deficits. And again, I think you have a rather intuitive picture here where if I don't have a complex, coherent sense of myself, there aren't larger meanings to guide my behavior. So there's no reason to sacrifice or to make great sacrifices if there's not a meaning behind them. And the boxes underneath metacognition are all the covariates. So this finding holds up irregardless of age, education, symptom severity, executive functioning scores, and social cognition. Here's a simple list of other studies with other outcomes related to poor metacognition. I'll highlight some of these in which we found that poor metacognition is related to being less active. And we measure activity by people wearing an actimeter, which measures how much they move around during the day. It's related to reasoning biases in which people are more likely to jump to conclusions, lesser levels of positive self-compassion, and in separate measures to less coherent and rich autobiographical accounts. Here's a full list of the most recent international research sites. So you'll see these are all the studies I've been mentioning have come out of, a range of places, including places that are as culturally disparate as China, the Netherlands, and Turkey. If you're wondering how in the world that could be, again, thinking that we're getting a narrative interview and then rating it, I think what we're rating are some of the structures that exist within the narrative that exist independent of the content, which maybe, and obviously one would expect, would be culturally driven. The third question is this something that can improve, or have we once again created a wonderful picture of the core deficit and we have to wait 40 years for some imaginary medicine that's never going to come? Sorry if I spoiled it for you younger people and you're going to wait these 40 years and you get to be our age. No, it's not coming. I'll be gone then, so you'll be stuck. You'll just have to be mad at me. So can actually metacognitive capacity improve? This is the question. So we've shown that deficits exist, that they're related to functional problems. And I'm going to just take you through one really brief case example and then turn to what the therapy might look like that might attempt to deal with metacognitive capacity. So this is the case of a guy we call Grieg, not his real name. But he was a guy who had profound symptomatology. He had really terrible neurocognitive deficits, very poor memory, very poor executive functioning, socially isolated, lots of self-stigma, a history of a number of traumatic events in his life, and not the usual psychotherapy patient in North America, not the intelligent, gifted, high-functioning person who can talk about the meaning of their life. anything else. But a guy who was suffering terribly, was really confused and really difficult to sit with. So I was the therapist. I met with Grieg at least once a week for 2.5 years. And what we went back and rated the metacognitive capacity within a given session by reading the therapy transcripts. And the rater didn't know if it was the first session or the last. We rated 2 sessions per month. So we got a rating of metacognition, and we were able to ask, did it change? And if so, at what rate for Grieg? And for those of you interested in the clinical applications, I think this is maybe the most important slide, because this is what it looks like in my clinic, particularly for people who've been ill for a while and have they've had a lot of cards dealt against them, a lot of bad cards in their hand from the get-go. You'll see the months down below, that's the 2.5 years. The mass A totals going up. Obviously, higher scores mean more integration, lower scores, less integration. And you can see that it starts out really low. It's hard to tell what Grieg's even talking about. There are strange lapses in the conversation. His thought is disjointed. I have a hard time understanding what he's saying. I have a hard time sitting with him for the full 45 minutes. I find myself getting bored, confused, doubting myself, thinking all of these fancy ideas are great for late night thinking and talking to your buddies over wine, but they're not real. And then Grieg starts to make a little sense, but then he goes away. It's like you get a signal, a crap, or even a worse word. What just happened? I thought we were making progress, and then we're back in the toilet. And if you can see my cursor here, right around 14 months, we're back in the toilet. And at this point, I'm definitely feeling like I'm a fraud. I'm trying hard to meet with the guy. That's not a fraud. I'm trying and listening, but I'm not really helping him. There's nothing I'm doing that's really very meaningful. And we're going to meet forever, and nothing's going to change. So these are the thoughts in my head. But Grieg starts to get a beat on making sense. He starts to really make sense of his life, and then it takes off. And this is a nonlinear line fit with a 95% confidence interval is what you see. In terms of content, what's happening is Grieg decides right around this point that his big problem isn't that he has psychosis. He doesn't even know what that means. That he's unable to love anyone. And he used to love people, but he can't love anymore. And therefore, he has no place in the world, nothing to offer, and he's left in agony and totally alone. What Grieg really spends the rest of the time doing, he figures out how to love people. He figures out how to love a grandchild, how to form connections and make repairs with some family members, with being more active, with doing things with people. And he's in charge of this, very much in the spirit of agency, self-management, and place in the world. He has a place as a loving grandfather to someone, which again doesn't come easily, and certainly doesn't happen, I think, if we give up. To anticipate one of your questions, we see things like this move faster with people who've not been ill as long. But for someone like Grieg, who's been on so many medicines and taken so many falls in his life, it seems like it takes a while for there to be a beat, and then he starts to be able to. This is a second case, Scarlatti. It's a similar case of a guy who was not a typical therapy case. Here we rated 1 therapy transcript per month for 2 years, 2.5 years. And this is the dark line here. And I think you see the same thing, up and down, up and down, up and down. And it's like there's progress and then crap, there's nothing. There's progress and crap, there's nothing. Once again, here, it's like this, I'm not doing anything for this guy. This is, again, a good try, but it doesn't work. But when you see the bigger picture, Scarlatti makes sense of his life. And this dotted line here is delusional severity within the session, rated by a separate person. And Scarlatti's clinical picture was plagued by these bizarre things that he believed that were grotesque, strange, and they would emerge in a flurry and disrupt the session and disrupt just about everything in the world that he tried to do. And those sort of vanish. And they vanish as Scarlatti makes more sense of the world. What he decides is different than Grieg, but we have this session where I can tell I've hurt him somehow. That one of my reactions has been caused him pain. And I asked him, I said, I think that I've caused you pain. I think I don't admire you in the ways that you need to be admired. And he said, but that's the whole problem. And this is his own conceptualization. The whole problem is that I don't think I deserve to be admired as much as I need to be. I don't think I deserve to be admired at all. And this then gets tied back to childhood sexual trauma, violent acts that he committed against others and others committed against him. And it's just a terribly chaotic family life with incest, mental illness, and violence growing up and then shortly thereafter. So for both Grieg and Scarlatti, there's up and down, but I think you can see in both of these people that metacognition does improve. There's a more recent paper by my friend and colleague, Marina Kukla, looking at metacognition in people involved in psychosocial rehabilitation, also showing some gradual changes in metacognition for a cohort receiving treatment, and that as that cohort improved in metacognition, other things improved as well.